Some people freeze long before winter ever finds them. The storm rolled across northern Montana like a living thing, swallowing the highway beneath waves of white and burying the pine forest in silence. Snow hammered the windshield of Ethan Cole's old Ford F-250 hard enough to sound like gravel, while freezing wind howled across the empty road outside Helena. It was 2:13 in the morning, the kind of hour when decent people were asleep and troubled men drove for no reason except to outrun their own thoughts. Ethan gripped the steering wheel with one scarred hand, eyes fixed on the blur ahead. Beside him, Rex suddenly lifted his head. The German Shepherd had been asleep only seconds earlier, curled against the truck seat beneath an old military blanket, but now every muscle in his body tightened. His ears stood upright. A low growl rolled deep through his chest. Ethan glanced sideways. "What is it, buddy?" Rex stared toward the darkness beyond the highway shoulder. Then he barked once. Sharp. Urgent. Not fear. Warning. Ethan slowed the truck instinctively. Snow drifted sideways through the beams of the headlights, turning the forest into ghostly shapes. There was nothing out there. Just frozen brush, fence posts disappearing under snow, and endless black woods. But Rex was already standing now, paws planted hard against the dashboard, amber eyes locked on something Ethan couldn't yet see. "Easy," Ethan murmured, though his own pulse had begun to quicken. The dog let out another growl, louder this time, then lunged toward the passenger door. Ethan pulled onto the shoulder. The tires crunched over packed ice as the truck stopped near a ditch almost completely buried beneath drifting snow. The moment Ethan opened the door, Rex exploded into the storm. Snow blasted into the cab. "Rex!" Ethan shouted, stepping out into knee-deep drifts. The cold hit instantly, brutal enough to sting his lungs. Wind tore through the trees with a hollow moan. Ahead, Rex was already digging wildly near the edge of the ditch, snow flying behind him in frantic bursts. Ethan grabbed his flashlight from the truck and pushed forward through the storm. "What did you find?" The beam cut across. White emptiness. Then suddenly, red. A thin streak beneath the snow. Blood. Ethan froze. Rex barked furiously now, paws clawing deeper into the drift until something appeared beneath the ice-covered powder. A hand. Old. Bare. Trembling weakly. Ethan dropped to his knees instantly. Jesus Christ. The elderly man beneath the snow barely moved. Frost covered his gray eyebrows and the edges of his beard. His lips were pale blue, his breathing shallow and uneven. One side of his face was bruised from exposure and cold. The man's eyes fluttered open for half a second as Rex pressed against him, trying desperately to warm him with his body heat. Ethan leaned closer. "Sir, can you hear me?" The old man stared past him into the storm with terrified eyes that didn't look afraid of dying nearly as much as they feared something else. His cracked lips trembled. Then, barely louder than the wind, he whispered, "Don't let my son see me here." Ethan felt something heavy settle inside his chest. Somewhere far down the road, through the curtain of snow, taillights vanished into the darkness. The emergency room smelled faintly of antiseptic, wet wool, and burnt coffee when Ethan carried Walter Hayes through the sliding hospital doors just before dawn. Snow still clung to the old veteran's boots and the frayed sleeves of his army coat while nurses rushed forward with blankets and questions. Rex stayed so close to the gurney that one orderly finally gave up trying to separate him. The German Shepherd walked beside Walter in silence, ears low, amber eyes never leaving the old man's face. Outside, the storm continued swallowing the town inch by inch, but inside St. Agnes Medical Center, the world softened into dim lights and quiet voices. Ethan stood near the hallway window while doctors worked. His gloves rested in his hands, soaked through with melted snow and streaked with dried blood from the ditch. He could still hear Walter's weak voice in his head. "Do not let my son see me here." Those words had not sounded like confusion. They had sounded like fear. Rex lay near the waiting room chairs but refused to sleep. Every few seconds the dog lifted his head toward the treatment room door as though listening for danger no one else could hear. Ethan knew that behavior. Rex had done the same thing overseas before mortar attacks, before ambushes, before moments when instinct moved faster than reason. A nurse approached quietly. "You family?" Ethan shook his head. "Just found him on the roadside." The woman looked disturbed. "In this weather?" Ethan glanced toward the dark window where snow pressed against the glass like white smoke. "Yeah." She lowered her voice. "Another hour out there and he probably would not have made it." Ethan looked down at the floor but said nothing. Somewhere deep inside him, anger moved slowly like old thunder. 2 hours later Walter finally opened his eyes. The old man looked smaller beneath the hospital blankets, his skin pale beneath the soft yellow lights. Frostbite had touched his fingertips. His breathing rattled faintly with exhaustion. Ethan sat quietly beside the bed while Rex rested his head near Walter's arm. For a long moment none of them spoke. Then Walter's trembling hand moved weakly toward the dog. Rex immediately pressed closer. "Good boy," Walter whispered hoarsely. His voice sounded fragile, worn thin by years and grief. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "You remember what happened?" Walter stared at the ceiling tiles for several seconds before answering. "Truck slid off the road." Ethan remained silent. Walter swallowed painfully. "Storm came fast." The words felt practiced. Empty. Ethan had seen enough broken men in his life to recognize when someone was protecting another person instead of themselves. Before he could speak again, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Rex's ears snapped upright instantly. A low growl rolled from deep inside his chest. Ethan turned toward the doorway just as a man stepped into view carrying a wet denim jacket over one shoulder. Mid-40s. Tired eyes. Smell of whiskey lingering beneath strong cologne. Daniel Hayes stopped cold when he saw the dog staring at him. For one brief second, something flickered across his face. Not surprise. Fear. Walter's entire body stiffened beneath the blankets. Rex stood slowly beside the bed, muscles tense, gaze locked on Daniel. Without blinking. The room suddenly felt colder than the storm outside. The storm finally weakened sometime after sunrise, but the cold remained trapped inside the hospital walls like a lingering ghost. Pale winter light spilled through the frosted windows of St. Agnes Medical Center, washing the hallways in soft gray silence while nurses moved quietly between rooms carrying paper cups of coffee and folded blankets. Ethan had not slept. He sat alone near the vending machines at the end of the corridor with Rex stretched beside his boots, the German shepherd resting but never fully relaxed. Every time footsteps echoed nearby, Rex lifted his head instantly. Ethan understood the feeling. Some nights the war never really ended. Around 8 in the morning, Daniel Hayes emerged from Walter's room with both hands shoved into the pockets of his denim jacket. His face looked exhausted, but there was something restless underneath it, like a man constantly calculating exits. He paused when he noticed Ethan watching him. "You the one who found my father?" Ethan nodded once. Daniel forced a thin smile. "Guess I owe you a thank you." His voice carried the rough edge of someone who had smoked too many cigarettes and slept too little. Ethan studied him carefully. Mid-40s. White male. Strong build gone slightly soft with age and bad habits. There was dried salt around the cuffs of his jeans from melted snow. "How did he end up out there?" Ethan asked quietly. Daniel shrugged too fast. "Old man gets confused sometimes. Probably wandered off after drinking." Rex stood immediately. The growl that left the dog's throat was low enough that nearby nurses glanced over nervously. Daniel took half a step backward before catching himself. "Easy with the mutt." Ethan did not move. He usually likes people. Daniel laughed awkwardly, but no warmth reached his eyes. Dogs never liked me much. Rex continued staring at him without blinking. Ethan had worked beside military dogs long enough to trust instincts over explanations. Rex was not reacting to nervousness. He was reacting to threat. Daniel looked toward the room where Walter rested. "Can I see my dad alone?" Ethan hesitated for only a second before nodding. The moment Daniel disappeared inside, Rex became agitated again. He paced once near the doorway, claws clicking softly against the tile floor. Ethan rested a hand against the dog's neck. "Talk to me, buddy." Rex stared toward the closed hospital door and released another uneasy growl. Inside the room, voices remained low at first. Too muffled to understand. Then silence. Then Walter speaking weakly. "Please, not now." Ethan's jaw tightened. A second later the door opened again. Daniel stepped out quickly, eyes avoiding Ethan completely this time. "I need some air," he muttered before walking fast toward the exit. Rex suddenly pulled hard against Ethan's grip. The dog lunged toward the hallway window overlooking the parking lot below. Ethan followed his gaze. Daniel stood beside an old pickup truck buried halfway in snow. He was not smoking. He was not calling anyone. He was staring up at Walter's hospital window with an expression so cold and empty that it stopped Ethan where he stood. Then Daniel opened the truck door, reached inside, and shoved something beneath the passenger seat before driving away into the fading storm. Rex continued growling long after the truck disappeared. By late afternoon the snowfall had finally slowed to a thin gray curtain drifting across the streets of Helena, but the skies still carried the heavy color of more winter to come. Ethan drove slowly through town with Rex seated upright beside him, both of them silent as the truck heater rattled warm air against the windshield. The hospital parking lot had stayed in Ethan's mind all day. So had the look on Daniel Hayes's face. Men carried guilt differently. Some hid it behind anger. Others buried it beneath excuses. But Ethan had spent too many years reading expressions in places where hesitation could get people killed. Daniel had not looked worried about his father. He had looked worried about being discovered. Rex suddenly shifted in his seat. His nose lifted toward the cracked window. Ethan glanced sideways. "You smell something." The German shepherd let out a quiet whine and stared toward a narrow side road leading away from downtown. Ethan slowed. Instinctively. At the corner stood an aging gas station wrapped in dirty snowbanks and flickering neon lights. Daniel's pickup truck was parked beside the air pump near the edge of the lot. The engine idled roughly beneath clouds of exhaust. Ethan felt Rex tense beside him immediately. "Stay." But Rex was already alert, ears forward, eyes locked on the truck. Daniel stood outside near the passenger door speaking hurriedly on his phone. His shoulders were tight against the cold wind. Ethan parked across the street beneath a dead cottonwood tree and watched quietly through the windshield. Daniel kept glancing around while talking. Nervous. Sweating despite the freezing air. Then he opened the passenger side door again and reached beneath the seat. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Daniel pulled out a small metal lockbox wrapped in an old towel. Even from 50 yards away Ethan could see the man hesitate before shoving the box quickly into the dumpster behind the gas station. Rex released a low growl. "Yeah," Ethan muttered softly. "I saw it too." Daniel climbed back into the truck and sped away moments later, tires sliding briefly over black ice before disappearing down the highway. Ethan waited until the taillights vanished. Then he crossed the street with Rex close beside him. The air smelled of gasoline, frozen asphalt, and snow-covered pine drifting from the mountains beyond town. Near the dumpster, Rex immediately became focused. He sniffed along the icy ground before stopping beside a heap of plowed snow. Then he pawed once at the edge of the metal container. Ethan climbed carefully around the drift and reached down into the shadows beneath discarded cardboard and frozen trash bags. His fingers touched cold metal almost instantly. The lockbox was heavier than he expected. Old military green. Rust around the corners. Ethan carried it back toward the truck while Rex stayed close against his leg. Inside the cab, he set the box carefully across the passenger seat. It was unlocked. For several seconds Ethan simply stared at it while snow tapped softly against the windshield. Then he lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded property contract stained with melted snow, several overdue bank notices, and a purple heart medal resting beside an old black and white photograph. Ethan picked up the picture carefully. A younger Walter Hayes stood smiling in military uniform beside a little blonde boy no older than 8 years old. Daniel. Before bitterness. Before fear. Before whatever had happened between them froze solid inside that family. Rex rested his head quietly against Ethan's arm. Then Ethan noticed something else beneath the paperwork. A silver flashlight with dried red stains near the cracked handle. The truck suddenly felt very still. Outside, snow drifted slowly through the darkening Montana evening while somewhere far away a church bell rang 6 times into the cold. That night the temperature dropped below 12 degrees, and the town settled beneath another layer of quiet snow. Streetlights glowed softly through the frozen air while Ethan sat alone inside his cabin nearly 15 miles outside Helena, the old lockbox resting open across the kitchen table beside a steaming mug of untouched coffee. Rex lay near the wood stove, though the German shepherd kept lifting his head toward the windows every time wind brushed against the glass. The fire crackled softly inside the cast iron stove, filling the room with warmth that somehow never fully reached Ethan anymore. He studied the photograph again beneath the yellow kitchen light. Walter looked proud in his old uniform. Strong. Alive. The little boy beside him smiled with both arms wrapped around his father's waist. Ethan had seen pictures like that before. Families frozen in happier years before life slowly hollowed them out from the inside. His eyes drifted toward the purple heart medal lying beside the bank notices. The metal reflected the firelight faintly. Walter Hayes had survived war overseas only to end up half buried in a snowbank less than 30 miles from home. Something about that truth sat heavy in Ethan's chest. Rex suddenly stood and walked toward him quietly. The dog rested his chin against Ethan's knee without making a sound. Ethan reached down automatically, fingers brushing through the thick sable fur around Rex's neck. "You knew before I did, huh?" Rex stared up at him calmly. Loyal. Watchful. The way some soldiers stayed even after the world stopped deserving it. Ethan exhaled slowly and leaned back in the chair. Outside, pine branches groaned beneath the weight of fresh snow. For a long moment the only sound inside the cabin was the soft ticking of the wall clock and the crackling fire. Then Ethan unfolded the property contract again. The farmhouse had been in Walter's name for 43 years. But a second document sat beneath it now. Transfer papers. Daniel Hayes had already filled out everything except the signature line. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. There were also foreclosure warnings from the bank, unpaid gambling debts, and a notice stamped final collection review in thick red letters. Desperation had been closing around Daniel for months. Maybe longer. Ethan understood desperation. He had seen good men drown beneath it before. But there was another detail that would not leave his mind. Walter's voice in the hospital. "Please, not now." Not fear of strangers. Fear of his own son. Rex suddenly growled low near the front door. Ethan looked up immediately. Headlights swept briefly through the cabin windows before disappearing. A vehicle slowing on the road outside. Then silence again. Ethan stood carefully and moved toward the dark window. Snow drifted across the driveway beneath pale moonlight, but tire tracks cut fresh through the powder near the mailbox. Someone had been watching the cabin. Rex remained perfectly still beside the door now, ears forward, body tense. Ethan rested one hand near the old pistol locked inside the cabinet by the hallway, though he never reached for it. After several long seconds the distant sound of an engine faded back toward town. Ethan stared into the darkness a moment longer before returning to the table. He picked up the photograph one final time. Walter and his son smiling together beneath a summer sky from decades ago. Ethan studied young Daniel's face carefully. Then quietly, almost to himself, he whispered, "What happened to you?" Rex did not lie back down that night. He stayed awake facing the windows until morning. The next morning arrived gray and bitterly cold, the kind of Montana dawn where the sky looked frozen long before the ground did. Frost covered the cabin windows in pale silver patterns while Ethan drove back toward St. Agnes Medical Center with Rex sitting silently beside him. The roads were slick with packed snow, and the mountains beyond Helena disappeared beneath low clouds heavy with another storm gathering somewhere beyond the valley. Ethan barely noticed the drive. His thoughts stayed trapped somewhere between the old photograph and Walter Hayes's frightened eyes. Inside the hospital, the heat smelled faintly of bleach and overcooked eggs drifting from the cafeteria downstairs. Nurses moved slower this morning, exhausted from the storm and the endless stream of winter accidents arriving through the emergency room overnight. Walter sat upright in bed now, wrapped in a faded green blanket with reading glasses balanced low across his nose. Morning light touched the deep lines in his weathered face, making him look older than he had the night before. Rex walked into the room first. The old man's tired expression softened immediately. "There he is," Walter whispered gently, reaching toward the dog with trembling fingers. Rex moved carefully beside the bed and rested his head against Walter's chest. Ethan noticed the old veteran's eyes glisten slightly behind the glasses. "He had a shepherd once," Walter said quietly without looking up. "Back in 1983. Dog named Cooper. Smartest thing I ever knew." Ethan leaned against the wall near the window. "What happened to him?" Walter smiled faintly, though sadness lingered beneath it. "Stayed beside me through 6 months of recovery after Kuwait. Slept outside my bedroom door every night." His voice weakened for a moment. "The dog died before my wife did. I think losing him hurt almost as much." Silence settled softly through the room. Outside, snow drifted past the windows in slow spirals. Ethan glanced toward the purple heart medal now resting inside his coat pocket. "You never mentioned your service." Walter looked away toward the falling snow. "A long time ago." Ethan stepped closer. "You saved men overseas, did you not?" Walter's tired eyes narrowed slightly with surprise. Ethan placed the old medal gently on the blanket. For several seconds Walter simply stared at it. Then his shoulders lowered beneath the weight of memory. "There was an ambush outside Basra," he murmured softly. "Vehicle caught fire. 3 boys trapped inside." His voice shook faintly now, not from weakness but from remembering. "I pulled them out before the ammunition cooked off." Rex remained still beside him as though listening. Walter touched the medal carefully with 2 trembling fingers. "Funny thing about war," he whispered. "People call you a hero for surviving things that never really leave you." Ethan understood that sentence too well. The room grew quiet again until Walter finally looked up at him directly. "Daniel was not always this way." Ethan said nothing. Walter swallowed hard. After his mother died, something in him started breaking little by little. Pain moved slowly across the old man's face now. "I kept thinking if I loved him enough, he would come back." Ethan stared out the hospital window toward the white mountains in the distance. "Sometimes people drown before they realize they are sinking." Walter gave a faint, exhausted nod. Then his expression suddenly changed. Rex lifted his head at the exact same moment. Footsteps approached down the hallway outside. Slow. Familiar. Walter's hand tightened instinctively against the blanket while Rex stood beside the bed with a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Daniel Hayes had come back. The hallway outside Walter's room fell strangely quiet as Daniel stepped through the doorway carrying a paper bag from the hospital cafeteria. Snow melted from the shoulders of his jacket onto the tile floor while the weak winter light behind him cast long shadows across the room. Rex immediately moved in front of Walter's bed. Not aggressive. Protective. The German Shepherd stood perfectly still with ears raised and amber eyes fixed on Daniel without blinking once. Walter lowered his gaze toward the blanket across his lap as though ashamed of something he could no longer hide. Daniel forced a tired smile. "Dad, I brought you coffee." His voice sounded softer today, carefully controlled, but Ethan noticed the tension beneath it immediately. Daniel's eyes flicked toward Ethan for only half a second before settling back on his father. "You feeling better?" Walter nodded faintly. "Some." Daniel stepped closer, but Rex released a deep warning growl that stopped him cold near the foot of the bed. A nurse passing outside glanced nervously through the doorway. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the dog's shoulder. "Rex." The growling softened but did not disappear. Daniel laughed awkwardly under his breath. "That dog really hates me." Ethan finally spoke. Dogs usually react to what people carry inside. Silence settled heavily over the room after that. Daniel placed the coffee carefully on the bedside table without meeting anyone's eyes. Walter stared weakly at the steam rising from the paper cup. "You should go home and rest," Daniel muttered quietly. "I can handle things here." Ethan watched Walter carefully. The old man's fingers trembled faintly against the blanket. Fear again. Small. Quiet. But there. Before Walter could answer, a sheriff's deputy appeared outside the room carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. Deputy Maria Bennett was a tall woman in her 40s with tired blue eyes and snow still dusting the brim of her winter hat. "Morning," she said gently. "I just need to ask Mr. Hayes a few questions about the accident." Daniel stiffened almost invisibly. Ethan noticed immediately. Walter looked down again. "It was my fault," he whispered. "Truck trouble. I slipped walking home." Deputy Bennett studied him for a long moment. She had likely heard lies spoken in frightened voices before. "Sir," she said carefully, "your body temperature was close to fatal when they found you. We just want to make sure nobody left you out there intentionally." Walter's jaw tightened. "Nobody did." Rex suddenly turned his head toward Daniel and growled again, louder this time. The deputy glanced toward the dog. Daniel stepped backward uneasily. "Can somebody control that animal?" Ethan remained calm. "He is trained." Deputy Bennett noticed the tension immediately. Her eyes shifted toward Daniel's snow boots near the doorway. Melted slush dripped slowly from the soles onto the tile floor. Then her expression changed slightly. "Sir," she said quietly, "mind if I ask where you were driving during the storm Tuesday night?" Daniel folded his arms defensively. "Looking for my father." "Anybody see you?" Daniel hesitated 1 second too long. Tiny. Almost invisible. But Ethan caught it. So did the deputy. "Gas station cameras probably did," she replied evenly. Daniel's face lost color for the first time. Walter suddenly spoke up weakly. "Please." Everyone turned toward him. The old veteran's eyes looked exhausted now, hollowed by something deeper than winter. "He is my son." The room fell silent except for the soft hiss of the hospital heater and the distant sound of snowplows scraping ice outside. Then Deputy Bennett looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully, "I may need to speak with you privately about what you found out there." Daniel slowly turned his head toward Ethan then, and for the first time the mask slipped completely. What stared back was not anger. It was panic. Snow began falling again just after sunset, thick slow flakes drifting across Helena beneath a darkening sky while Ethan drove Walter home from the hospital in silence. The old farmhouse stood nearly hidden beneath snow-covered pines at the end of a narrow gravel road 20 miles outside town. Porch lights glowed faintly through the storm like tired lanterns refusing to go out. Walter sat quietly in the passenger seat wrapped in Ethan's spare military coat while Rex rested his head across the center console between them. The old veteran had barely spoken during the drive. Every few miles he simply stared through the windshield at the frozen fields passing outside as though searching for pieces of a life that no longer existed. When the truck finally stopped in front of the farmhouse, Walter looked toward the house with visible hesitation. "He will come back," he whispered. Ethan shut off the engine slowly. "I know." The porch steps creaked beneath their boots as they climbed through drifting snow. Inside, the farmhouse smelled faintly of dust, old coffee, and firewood that had not been burned in weeks. Family photographs lined the hallway walls beneath a thin layer of neglect. A younger Walter in uniform. A smiling woman with auburn hair standing beside him near a fishing lake. Daniel as a boy holding a baseball glove nearly too big for his hands. Time had once lived warmly inside this house. Now the silence felt hollow. Ethan helped Walter settle into a chair beside the stone fireplace while Rex wandered slowly through the rooms, sniffing corners carefully like a sentry checking forgotten ground. Wind rattled softly against the windows. Walter stared into the cold fireplace for several long seconds before finally speaking. "I should have done better by him." Ethan knelt beside the hearth, stacking fresh logs carefully. "You loved him." Walter's tired eyes glistened faintly in the firelight. "Sometimes love is not enough." The first flames began crackling softly between the logs just as headlights swept suddenly across the front windows. Rex reacted instantly. His ears snapped upright. A low growl rolled through the room. Walter's face drained of color. Outside, tires crunched over frozen gravel before a truck door slammed hard against the storm. Ethan rose slowly to his feet. Through the frosted glass of the front window he could see Daniel striding toward the porch through falling snow, shoulders tense beneath his dark jacket. The front door burst open before anyone could speak. Cold wind rushed into the house carrying snowflakes and the sharp smell of whiskey. Daniel stopped short when he saw Ethan standing near the fireplace. "You took him here." His voice shook now. Not with anger alone. Fear. Exhaustion. Desperation. Walter lowered his head weakly. "Daniel, no." Daniel pointed toward the old man with trembling hands. "You called the cops on me." "I did not," Walter whispered. Daniel laughed harshly beneath his breath. "They questioned me at the station for 2 hours." Rex moved silently between Walter and the doorway. The German shepherd stood firm now, body still as stone, eyes fixed entirely on Daniel. Ethan stepped forward slightly. "You should leave." Daniel looked at him then. Really looked at him for the first time. "You think you know anything about my family?" Snow swirled through the open doorway behind him while tears suddenly filled his exhausted eyes. "You know what it is like watching debt swallow your life? Watching hospitals take everything after your mother dies?" His breathing grew uneven now. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Walter stared at his son with heartbreaking sadness. Daniel's voice cracked. "I just needed him to sign the papers." Silence swallowed the room after that. Only the fire crackled softly behind Ethan while snow drifted through the open door onto the wooden floorboards. Then Daniel looked down at Rex standing protectively before Walter. The dog never moved. Never blinked. And for the first time since arriving, Daniel lowered his eyes in shame. Winter loosened its grip slowly over the following weeks. Snow still covered the open fields around Helena in pale uneven patches, but the hard killing cold had begun to soften beneath longer afternoons and thin streams of meltwater running beside the roads. At the farmhouse, smoke finally rose from the chimney again each morning. The place no longer felt abandoned. Walter spent most days wrapped in a heavy wool sweater near the fireplace while Rex followed him faithfully from room to room like a silent guardian who had decided his mission was not over yet. Ethan repaired things quietly around the property whenever he was not driving into town for supplies. Broken fence posts. Frozen pipes beneath the barn. A sagging porch rail weathered by too many Montana winters. None of them spoke much while working. Men carrying old grief rarely did. Yet little by little, warmth returned to the house in ways words could not explain. One morning Walter stood at the kitchen sink watching sunlight spill across the snow-covered pasture outside. His hands still trembled slightly from the cold he survived, but color had returned to his face. On the windowsill beside him sat an old photograph of Daniel as a child holding a trout nearly as long as his arm while laughing beside his father at some forgotten lake years ago. Walter stared at it for a long time. "The sheriff says he took the plea deal," he murmured quietly. Ethan looked up from repairing a cabinet hinge. Nearby. Probation. Mandatory treatment. Debt counseling. Walter nodded once without turning around. Good. But the sadness in his voice remained. Not anger. Not hatred. Just the quiet sorrow of a father mourning someone still alive. Outside on the porch, Rex suddenly barked once toward the driveway. Ethan stepped to the window. A pickup truck sat parked near the mailbox beneath the pale spring sunlight. Daniel climbed out slowly carrying a cardboard box in both hands. He looked thinner now. Exhaustion hung visibly around him like something heavier than snow ever was. Walter froze at the sink. Silence settled through the kitchen. Then Ethan opened the front door. Daniel stopped several feet from the porch, uncertain whether he belonged there anymore. Rex stood beside Ethan but did not growl this time. The dog simply watched him carefully. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking. "I brought back some of Mom's things from storage." His voice sounded smaller than before. "I figured he should have them." Walter stepped slowly onto the porch behind Ethan. Father and son stared at one another beneath the soft Montana wind moving through the pines. For several long seconds nobody spoke. Then Daniel lowered his eyes. "I am sorry, Dad." The words came out broken. Honest. Painfully late. Walter's weathered hand tightened slightly against the porch rail. Tears filled his tired eyes, but his voice stayed gentle. "I know." Daniel nodded once, unable to say anything else. He left the box carefully near the steps before walking back toward the truck alone. Halfway there, he stopped and looked back. Rex remained beside Walter without moving. Loyal. Steady. The kind of presence that asks nothing except truth. Daniel gave the faintest nod toward the dog before climbing into the truck and driving away beneath the thawing sky. That evening the three of them sat quietly on the porch while the last snow melted across the distant fields. Rex rested at Walter's feet. Ethan sipped black coffee from an old tin mug while sunset painted the mountains gold beyond the trees. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes stirred softly in the spring air. Walter closed his eyes for a moment and breathed. Deeply, like a man finally learning what safety felt like again. And in the fading light, with one soldier beside him and one faithful dog guarding the silence, the old veteran no longer looked abandoned.